Kevin? Kevin?
Maya, what a surprise. Assuming you're here to see Kevin.
You're never going to see him again.
Wait, what?
I never would have gave Brittany and Dr. Foster. It wouldn't have happened.
I'm not breaking the news to her. You break the news to her. They found her in an intersection playing in traffic, and she's lucky to be alive. Do you understand? You're not fit to be a foster.
Hey, look, I'm sorry if you're having a bad day, but you really can't be rude to me like that,
You can't tell my dad what I'm about to tell you, okay?
Okay. Well, as long as no one's dead.
It's actually about sex. I just hate doing it. It's all right. Thank you.
Hey, you defiled my son.
The opening scene of this film introduces a tense, emotionally charged encounter between Alexis and Maya that initially appears to be structured around authority, judgment, and generational power, but gradually reveals itself as a study in projection, repression, and unexpected recognition between two women navigating constrained emotional roles. And when approached through a queer, emotionally grounded lens, the scene becomes less about confrontation and more about the slow unraveling of carefully maintained identities. Alexis is introduced as a controlling, highly vigilant maternal figure whose sense of self is tightly bound to her role as protector, gatekeeper, and moral arbiter of her son's life. And her first interaction with Maya is steeped in condescension and suspicion, reflecting a broader cultural tendency to scrutinize young women's bodies, desires, and autonomy through a moralizing lens. Maya, by contrast, enters the space tentative but self-possessed, her initial politeness and concern for Kevin signaling emotional investment rather than recklessness. And yet she is immediately positioned by Alexis as a threat rather than a person, a symbolic stand-in for disorder, temptation, and loss of control. The dialogue reveals Alexis's preoccupation not only with her son's academic performance and behavior, but with the idea of purity, discipline, and propriety, concepts that are often disproportionately imposed on women and used to justify surveillance of their relationships and bodies. Through this lens, Alexis's accusations toward Maya read less as maternal concern and more as a displaced anxiety about desire itself, particularly desire that exists beyond her control or comprehension. The revelation that Kevin has been sent away without Maya's knowledge underscores the imbalance of power at play and highlights how women's emotional lives are often treated as expendable collateral in decisions made by others, reinforcing a familiar pattern in which young women are denied agency or closure in relationships shaped by institutional or familial authority. Yet as the confrontation escalates, the scene subtly shifts its emotional center away from Kevin entirely, reframing him as almost incidental to the intensity now circulating between Alexis and Maya. The language Alexis uses becomes increasingly charged, not simply with judgment but with fixation, as her critique of Maya's presence, behavior, and influence lingers with an intimacy that exceeds its stated purpose. From a queer interpretive perspective, this moment is significant because it demonstrates how same-gender attraction in women is often expressed obliquely, filtered through hostility, moral superiority, or exaggerated concern, particularly in environments where direct acknowledgement of desire would threaten social roles or self-concepts. Alexis's authority as a mother, her wealth, and her cultivated composure function as armor against vulnerability, yet they also trap her within a rigid identity that leaves little room for emotional truth. And Maya's presence destabilizes that structure not through overt provocation, but through proximity and refusal to collapse under judgment. Maya's responses, marked by confusion, hurt, and dawning anger, reflect the emotional labor frequently demanded of younger women when confronted by institutionalized power, yet she also exhibits a growing clarity about the injustice of the situation, a clarity that mirrors many queer women's experiences of recognizing when moral condemnation masks something more complicated and personal. The scene's queerness does not reside in explicit declaration, but in its emotional subtext, in the way the conversation becomes charged with recognition, challenge, and a destabilization of presumed hierarchies, inviting viewers to consider how desire can surface in moments of conflict precisely because such moments strip away rehearsed civility. Alexis's fixation on Maya's supposed influence over Kevin, her repeated references to distraction and corruption, can be read as a projection of her own disavowed impulses, a classic psychoanalytic dynamic that resonates strongly within queer histories, where same-gender desire has often been displaced into moral panic or exaggerated control. Importantly, the film does not frame Maya as a temptress or Alexis as a villain, but instead presents both women as constrained by social scripts that deny them the language to articulate what is actually unfolding between them. This restraint is crucial, as it resists sensationalizing their interaction and instead invites a reading grounded in emotional realism, where attraction is inseparable from fear, power, and self-protection. For lesbian and queer women viewers, this dynamic may feel deeply familiar, echoing experiences of being scrutinized by other women in positions of authority, admiration, or envy, where the intensity of attention feels disproportionate yet unmistakably personal. The scene also speaks to how admiration and fixation can masquerade as disapproval in cultures that remain uneasy with women loving women, particularly across age or status differences, and how such dynamics are often rendered invisible or illegible unless explicitly named. Maya's youth and Alexis's authority create an ethical tension that the film treats with seriousness rather than exploitation, emphasizing discomfort, imbalance, and the need for accountability rather than romanticizing the power differential, which aligns with a queer ethical framework that prioritizes consent, awareness, and mutual recognition. At the same time, the film allows space to examine how such imbalances are socially produced, and how they shape women's ability to understand and articulate their feelings, especially when those feelings contradict socially sanctioned identity. Alexis's references to her husband and son, her invocation of lineage and inheritance, suggest a life structured around men yet emotionally centered on control rather than connection. And the sudden absence of Kevin exposes the hollowness of that structure, leaving Alexis alone with her unresolved emotions and the woman who has unexpectedly become their focal point. Maya's presence thus becomes catalytic, forcing Alexis to confront not only her cruelty but her loneliness, her rigidity, and the emotional cost of a life spent policing desire rather than experiencing it. For women more broadly, regardless of sexual orientation, the scene resonates as an exploration of how repression, burnout, and the prioritization of responsibility over authenticity can calcify into bitterness and judgment, and how moments of rupture, however uncomfortable, can also offer opportunities for self-recognition. The film critiques societal discomfort with women's intimacy by refusing to frame this interaction as scandalous or illicit, instead grounding it in emotional realism and ethical tension. And by doing so, it challenges the tendency either to erase such connections or to sensationalize them without regard for their psychological complexity. The absence of explicit physicality keeps the focus firmly on dialogue, posture, tone, and emotional shifts, reinforcing the idea that intimacy is not defined by action alone, but by attention, recognition, and the willingness to be affected by another person. Symbolically, Alexis represents institutional power, inherited privilege, and the illusion of control, while Maya embodies vulnerability, openness, and the disruptive potential of being seen without pretense. And their interaction mirrors real-life dynamics within queer communities where mentorship, authority, and attraction can become entangled in ways that demand careful navigation and ethical clarity. The scene also highlights how queer women are often required to justify or downplay their feelings to remain respectable or safe, and how this pressure can delay self-understanding or redirect desire into socially acceptable channels, such as criticism or control. By centering the women's interior lives rather than external spectacle, the film positions their encounter as a moment of emotional truth rather than provocation, emphasizing that what matters is not the shock of the situation but the honesty it demands. Ultimately, this scene sets the tone for the film as a whole, signaling a commitment to exploring women's relationships with nuance, restraint, and respect, and inviting viewers to reflect on the quiet resilience required to become visible to oneself and others in a world that still struggles to acknowledge women's love for women as serious, meaningful, and worthy of thoughtful representation.